Now this is going to be a proper cool off. Hi guys, Matthew here and welcome back again to my channel. Since I recently got Noctua's new NH-U12A air CPU cooler, I have decided to do a little bit of a standoff between it and this also very beefy and very popular Be Quiet's Dark Rock 4 air CPU cooler, the Pro version of it. I know it's not a completely fair comparison as Noctua's model is more expensive, while on the other hand Be Quiet's model is a dual tower design one, but still it will be interesting to see how they stack up against each other. The new NH-U12A is basically a successor of its popular NH-U12S brother, and although at first glance they seem to be completely the same, they're not, since the NH-U12A has a thicker heatsink profile and comes in with two of their new NF-A12X25 PWM 120mm fans, which were so long in development, close to 5 years, that they almost become a myth in a way. They are a real piece of engineering art. The distance between the inner part of the frame and the fan blade is only 0.5mm, which is 3 to 6 times smaller than usual. Because of this, they had to use, or create to be precise, a special material which they've called Sterox, which is a novel liquid crystal polymer type of material. It brings in less wear of material and before all their stretching, as centrifugal forces which are applied onto fan blades due to them spinning end up in stretching them over time, where they could rub off the frame if it were a classic ABS thermoplastic in question. Of course, besides getting them by buying this cooler, you can also buy them separately if you wish to for your chassis. They have your usual flavors, all of them being 120mm in size as of now. Other than that, the NH-U12A has a pretty standard looking single tower style heatsink design, counting 50 very nicely threaded aluminum fins and a total of 7 nickel plated 6mm copper heat pipes running through them in this densely looking pattern as seen from the top, as well as Noctua's engraved logo and this slide cutout for easier access of the screwdriver. Of course, on the bottom we are greeted by this very nicely polished and also nickel-plated copper CPU base contact plate. Taking a closer look at Be Quiet's Dark Rock Pro 4 cooler, we have a completely blacked out dual tower fin stack design with a total of also 7 6mm copper heat pipes running down through cooler's heatsink and taking you to the CPU cooler base, which was not as polished out as Noctua's one. With it, you'll also get two low RPM fans from their Silent Wing 3 series, which I personally really like as they prove to be a great combination of performance and noise level, but what's interesting about them in this case is that you'll get two different size ones, a 120mm one squeezed between the towers and 135mm one for the outer side. The installation process for both coolers is basically as easy as it can be. You can do it in less than 5 minutes. In this case, when it comes to Intel's 1150X platform, that being my Core i5-8600K and ASRock's Z390 Phantom Gaming 7 motherboard, you'll get a backplate with screws already in it, onto which you put the standoff bits, or you screw them into the backplate in case of the Dark Rock Pro 4 cooler, and on top of them we have these two plates which form a single frame line on each side. Then you just put the cooler on top of the CPU and secure it using the crossbar which screws onto those plates. When it comes to installing the coolers onto an AMD based motherboard, in my case that was the AM4 platform, Ryzen 7 3700X CPU and ASRock's X570 creator model, be sure to stick around and subscribe for the review of that motherboard. Basically you just need to pull the plastic parts off and reuse the stock backplate, while everything else is pretty straightforward installation wise as it was with Intel's platform, with the use of different standoffs and frame plates from the cooler's bundle box. Overall, I feel like Noctua's cooler is a bit easier to install, since it doesn't have that fixed metal top plate, which complicates fans and especially the cooler installation, but you will get a long screwdriver, with both models actually, so you can reach the screws through the punched out top plate of the Dark Rock Pro 4 cooler, which also has these cool caps that just screw in after you're done with the installation. This is mostly on account of it being a dual tower design, so it's hard to compare them solely based on that. But another thing that Noctua has over it is that since it's a single tower cooler, the NH-U12A has a better RAM clearance, For example, you can put the RAM kits after you install the heatsink, which is something you cannot do with the Be Quiet's cooler for the first 2 RAM slots if the RAM kit is just a bit taller than your regular RAM kit model with no or minimal heat spreader. Once you put them in, their height is not that big of a problem, especially in Noctua's case, since you can adjust it easily with moving the fan clips up a bit. Speaking of those, it's much easier to put them back on Noctua's model, while you really need to put some effort in putting the fans on, and especially off with Be Quiet's fan clips, plus it's really easy to scratch that black paint job with them. Both of them clear the space around the first PCI Express slot, but nowadays this kind of placement for the first PCI Express slot at the very top is becoming a rare sight more and more, especially with high-end motherboards, so it's not that big of a concern. Before I continue with the results, just a few additional side notes. With both coolers and CPUs, I've used Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut thermal paste so I can have a more consistent comparison rather than using their own bundled paste. Also, you will hear me referring to a temperature span instead of a one specific number when talking about the CPU temperature results which I got here, and that's because the CPU temperatures always move up and down a few degrees, especially if you have a temperature insight to every single core, even when they taper off, as it just cannot be fixed value over a certain time period or at all. It's always moving about, even at idle, but I think you're all pretty much familiar with this notion. Since the fan speeds can vary depending on the fan profile within the motherboard's BIOS, I've decided to use the same motherboard manufacturer both for Intel's and AMD's platform, that being ASRock as you already saw by now, so those fan profiles can have a consistent configuration. I've used 2 of those, one was their so-called standard fan profile and the other one was full speed fan profile, and that second one I only use within the overclocking environment because you're not going to use it at stock settings, there's no point, and I did that just to see by how much it can lower down the temperature, which is the reason why I'm talking about the fan speed and noise first, before talking about the actual CPU temperatures, as it has a direct connection to it. Of course, the best thing you can do is to set up a manual fan curve, see what suits your case the best, because there are a bunch of different factors which vary from setup to setup and which can affect the cooling capabilities, starting from the CPU itself to the chassis airflow. I've used the Y fan splitter to connect the fans onto one CPU fan header on the motherboard, just so I can have the fans reacting at the same time according to the signal change, and with that a more consistent testing ground, so to speak. And of course, if you wish to, you can separate them for more fine control, but even if I would to separate them, they would react the same as I've used the same fan profile across the board, unless I use different fan profile or a manual fan curve between them. In the case of Be Quiet's Silent Wings 3 fans, under ASRock's standard fan profile and CPU idling, I was seeing them running at 600 RPM, while Noctua's fans were running at around 800 RPM. Under stock load that was around 1100 RPM for Dark Rock Pro 4 and around 1200 RPM for NH-U12A. They also, or to be precise ASRock's motherboard's fan profile, kept that same fan speed even when I threw some overclocking settings at them. Of course, there's a difference between them in speed since they have different maximal RPM. For example, Noctua's ones run at around 2100 RPM at full speed, while Be Quiet's ones stop out at just a bit below 1900 RPM. And while the RPM readout in the hardware monitor for Noctua's fans was as declared by their specifications when you count in the tolerances, the Be Quiet's was off, but I assume that is due to them being connected to a single fan header using the Y splitter while having different maximal fan speed specifications at 12 volts, which is 1200 RPM for the larger 135mm fan and 1500 RPM for the smaller 120mm fan. With that said, you could probably extrapolate their exact fan speed based on the maximal fan speed readout from the hardware monitor and knowing their specifications, but in the end the noise which they produce talks for itself. Again, all of this is not set in stone. You can and you should adjust your fan speed manually in motherboard's BIOS or some kind of utility software and set up a fan curve that suits your scenario the best, depending on what you would like to achieve noise and performance wise, and of course your CPU and chassis setup. Of course, in the end, Noctua's one were much louder than Be Quiet's at full speed because of the difference in maximal fan speed. But in a way this doesn't matter so much since you won't use them like that, at their full speed that is, while they were both whisper quiet under stock load. Here's an audio example for each of those cases, while also showing you a sound meter for a measurement comparison. Finally, coming down to the performance side of things, checking out the temperatures of Intel's CPU under load, there's actually nothing too exciting happening here. The Core i5-8600K isn't a TDP monster, it's a 6-core non-hyper-threaded CPU after all, even with all of its cores winded to 1.3 volts of core voltage and 5.1 GHz of clock speed in my overclocking scenario, it was staying nice and cool below 70 degrees Celsius in both cases under full load. Here the difference in performance between them is almost negligible, but it does go in favor of the Noctua on average by a degree or two. The same goes for the stock load performance. Noctua was basically below the 50 degrees Celsius mark for the whole time, while Be Quiet's cooler was roaming around that mark, few degrees above, few degrees below. As for the idle temperatures, in both cases it was below 30 degrees Celsius, and basically there's nothing to compare since Intel's power saving technologies taper off everything to a pretty much same level. Crossing over to AMD's pretty beefy 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 3700X CPU, things get a bit more interesting as now we can really check out the full potential of both coolers as they try to drain as much heat possible from this CPU. Here we can see the difference in cooling capabilities of each model a bit clearer, especially since AMD rounds out the CPU temperature in one package. At stock load, the NH-U12A was again handling it a few degrees better, mostly around 82 to 84 degrees Celsius, with a peak of 93 degrees Celsius, which was probably an anomaly because it was way below that majority of the time. On the other hand, the Dark Rock Pro 4 peaked at 88 degrees Celsius, while it was steadily roaming around 84 to 86 degrees Celsius. In the case of overclocking this CPU, I've managed to get stable 4250 MHz across all cores, at just a bit below 1.4 volts for the core voltage, which was roughly 0.05 volts more than what you see with the stock settings. This of course introduced another stress level for the coolers, which again Noctua's model handled better, as you can see it here. It managed to keep it at around 90 degrees Celsius, with peak being at 92 degrees Celsius, while Be Quiet's model peaked at 96 degrees Celsius and was roaming around 92 to 94 degrees Celsius. Again, the idle temperatures at stock settings were pretty much spot on in both cases, as AMD also has its own power saving features, which brings that down to a similar level. With both of them blasting at full fan speed and with CPUs being overclocked, in the case of Core i5-8600K, the temperature went down by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius with both coolers, while in the case of Ryzen 7 3700X, with the Dark Rock Pro 4 cooler, I saw roughly the same temperature drop, while with the NH-U12A cooler it was a little bit less pronounced, 2 or 3 degrees on average. When you sum all of this up, both of these coolers are excellent and basically one of the top choices when it comes to air CPU coolers. Of course, each of them have their own quirks, but they will provide you with best of both worlds, being it cooling or noise-wise. Bottom line, you cannot go wrong with either of them. The Dark Rock Pro 4 is maybe a bit more attractive since it will cost you less, Plus, I assume that most of you will like its dark matte look over NH-U12A. On the other hand, for such a relatively small package compared to Be Quiet's model, Noctua really made a capable cooling solution, as they pretty much always do, but then again, it will cost you a pretty penny more, so you'll have to weigh in on that too once it comes to decision time. That's it for this time from me. Thank you once again for watching. Toss me a thumbs up if you enjoyed my content, that really helps a lot. And if you like what you saw, feel free to subscribe, and if you already are, be sure to press that notification bell down below so you don't miss out on a new video. And until then, catch you later guys.